In 399 BCE, Socrates has the opportunity in the apology or defense to defend himself against charges brought by Miletus and others at trial. These charges included things like Socrates is a corrupting influence on Athenian society, he disbelieves in the gods of the state, he invents new gods, he may be an atheist, he may be a sophist who has no regard for the truth. And at some point, he has the opportunity to cross-examine Miletus, and Miletus says, among other things, that Socrates not only does wrong, but he intends to do wrong. He intends to corrupt the youth of Athens. He intends to corrupt Athens as a whole. In today's legal context, of course, we still look at intention as being very important. If you can show that a person not only accidentally broke a law, but that they intended to break a law, the consequences for them, the punishment for them, can be much more severe. So Miletus's strategy here seems actually quite sound in terms of, basic law school 101, at least for criminal law. So he wants to say that Socrates intentionally corrupts others. Now, when Socrates starts his cross-examination, he gets Miletus to accept that no one would harm himself or herself. You may think that this is false. You may think that people might injure themselves willingly all the time. But notice, Miletus doesn't accept that. And if you're going to have an argument with somebody, it makes sense not to saddle them with the belief that they don't accept, but rather to sort of go where they are, to find some assumption that they make, and then maybe derive some inconsistency or contradiction from it. And that's what Socrates intends to do here. Miletus also accepts that good neighbors are good precisely because they benefit us, but bad ones actually harm us. So if given a choice between living in close proximity to good people as opposed to bad people, a reasonable person would choose the good people precisely because good people benefit us, or at the very least, they don't harm us. This leads us to the following argument, which I'll separate into different premises and a conclusion. Premise 1 says, no one would intentionally harm himself. Does Miletus accept this? Yes. Should we? Well, hang on a moment. Premise 2, it's better to live among good people than bad people because bad people are more likely to harm us. Miletus would accept this. Premise 3, if a person intentionally harmed other people, he would intentionally be making them worse rather than better people. i.e., he'd be making them bad. The scenario here, the logic here is such that in harming another person, if I really know that I'm harming them, I have to know that I'm not really doing them any favors. I'm corrupting them. I'm making them worse off than they would be otherwise. Another way to put that is to say, I'm not making the person a better person, I'm making them a worse person. And that person is more likely, of course, to harm us and others. So, premise 4, if one intentionally harmed other people, one would intentionally be making them worse, thereby harming oneself. The idea here, of course, is that what goes around comes around. If I harm other people, then they're going to harm me. If I know that in harming other people, they're going to harm me, then that seems counterintuitive, because premise 1 says no one would intentionally harm himself. Therefore, conclusion, no one intentionally harms others. In other words, if the thinking behind intending to harm other people, if I really believe that I'm harming other people, if that entails that I have to know that I'm harming myself, because in harming other people, I'm making them worse, and in making them worse, I'm making it more likely that they're going to harm me, I can't intend to harm myself, and therefore I can't intend to harm other people. So, in sum, what Socrates is suggesting here in the Apology is that wrongdoing is actually the consequence of ignorance. It's not that we're willing to do bad things. It's just that we are ignorant, and that's why we do bad things. If we just knew the right thing to do, if we really knew we were harming other people, we wouldn't do it. Now, here are some potential problems. First of all, it seems pretty counterintuitive to say people don't intend to harm others. If anything, the world seems to be littered with people, some of whom do good things believing that they're good, and other people who will say, no, I mean, I know that I shouldn't have lied to that person, but I lied. I know that I shouldn't have killed that person, but I killed that person. I know that I shouldn't have cheated on X or done Y or not done Z, and yet I did. And so it just seems counterintuitive given the preponderance of the evidence. Our experience is such that we think that people really do have a choice, and the choice is between doing good and doing bad. Now, in some cases, we may not know what the right or wrong thing actually is, but those are sort of special cases. Presumably, in some cases, we do have some firm conviction that there's something that we shouldn't do, and yet we still do it anyway. And if that's true, it seems like there's something wrong with this argument. Now, a second point here is, and this may explain what's wrong with the argument, it appears as though people oftentimes do harm themselves intentionally. People will engage in illegal drug use, oftentimes knowing precisely what the drugs will do to their bodies. People will injure themselves. They will engage in self-cutting, or they will do things which create great, sometimes inordinate risk to themselves. Even though they know that, they continue to do that. There are also cases in which people will literally commit suicide, and it's difficult to see how they couldn't believe that they're harming themselves. Now, there is a way around this. If you're Socrates, or if you're, a good critical reasoner, you could say that, well, wait a second, the person who engages in drug use doesn't really want to harm themselves, if by harming themselves you mean that they want to ultimately destroy themselves. What they're doing is they're willing to accept a certain degree of risk, such as the possibility that they could die of an overdose, or that they could develop cirrhosis of the liver, or that they could get hepatitis, or any number of other diseases. They're willing to put up with those risks in order to get some benefit, the benefit being some sort of high or some escape from pain. Same thing in the case of people with self-injury, or in the case of people who engage in very risky behaviors like unprotected sex, or being a daredevil and jumping out of an airplane without a parachute or something like that. People do very seemingly crazy things, but if they believe that they can maybe get away with doing it without harming themselves, maybe their ultimate justification there is not that they want to harm themselves, but that they ultimately will risk harming themselves because there's some greater payout in the end. Even suicide is sometimes described from a psychological perspective as an attempt to will something that's ultimately good for one. Even if you believe that there's nothing after death and the only thing suicide would do is help you escape from a certain degree of pain, so the argument goes, then suicidal behavior ultimately would not be a form of self-harm. Now, of course, these situations are all very different, but all I'm suggesting here is some people have argued that even these instances, which on the surface look like cases in which people harm themselves, could be redescribed in ways that produce or suggest that people are producing more benefit for themselves ultimately. And a third problem I'll mention here is the argument assumes that if we harm people, they will harm us. But what if we think we can avoid this? Aren't you more likely to speed in a car if you believe that there's no police officer around? Isn't this why people have things like radar detectors? Are you more likely to cheat on an exam even though you might know that cheating is really a bad thing? Aren't you more likely to do that if you believe that you'll get away with it? Isn't the whole notion nowadays of modern warfare based largely upon the idea that we can take things like drones and we can send them to other countries and we can harm other people? And we know that we're harming other people, but we do that with the understanding that we're trying to somehow minimize the risk to ourselves. And so even in those cases, you could say, okay, it's not that people believe that they're not doing anything wrong, but rather they're doing something wrong, they are harming other people, but they're more likely to do it if they think they can get away with it. And in Socrates' case, he doesn't really consider that as a possibility, maybe because he was thinking, look, I live in Athens, it's a small community, obviously if I harm my neighbor, they're ultimately going to harm myself. But there's no absolute guarantee about that. Many people will cheat on their spouses, cheat on exams, cheat on their taxes, even murder people if they think they can get away with it. And so in those cases, of course, it's by no means a foregone conclusion that we will always avoid doing such things if we think we can get away with it. Now, the interesting rejoinder to this is Socrates could say, okay, well, in those cases, that's perfectly consistent with my argument, right? I'm saying people will try to avoid doing wrong if they think they can't get away with it. But then in cases in which they believe they can get away with it, they will still do wrong. So that actually falsifies one of the premises of the argument, right? One of the premises of the argument says, if we do things that we believe will harm other people and we think that will harm ourselves, then we won't do them. But in these particular cases, it looks like there may be instances in which that will not happen, in which case, yes, we could on Socratic grounds, understand why we actually do bad things sometimes. Anyway, do you think that all wrongdoing is the product of ignorance, or do you think that there are actually evil people in the world? Let's talk about this another time.